The space station Harmony Prime buzzed with nervous energy as delegates from across the galaxy gathered for the most important peace summit in centuries. The massive structure rotated slowly against the backdrop of distant stars, its gleaming hull reflecting the light of 3 different suns. Inside, beings from dozens of species moved through the corridors, their various forms creating a living tapestry of galactic diversity. Sergeant Marcus Chen stood at attention outside the main conference hall, his marine dress uniform crisp and spotless. The human delegation had arrived 3 days ago, and Marcus had been selected as their ceremonial guard, a role that was supposed to be purely symbolic. His weathered face remained impassive as alien dignitaries passed by, some barely reaching his waist while others towered above him on multiple legs. The Zephyrian Empire had sent their most elite royal guard, beings that stood nearly 9 feet tall with crystalline exoskeletons that shifted colors based on their emotions. Currently, the lead guard displayed deep purple patterns across his carapace, a sign of barely contained aggression. His name was Kethavar, and he had made it clear from the moment of arrival that he considered the human presence an insult to the proceedings. The mammals should not be here, Kethavar had announced in perfect galactic standard to anyone within hearing range. They have no understanding of true warfare, no concept of honor. Their entire species is barely 2 centuries old in space travel. What wisdom could they possibly offer in matters of galactic security? Marcus had listened to these comments for 3 days without response. Marine training had taught him discipline, and diplomatic protocol demanded silence. But as he watched the towering alien intimidate smaller delegates with his presence, something burned quietly in his chest. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy for their military prowess, their undefeated record in personal combat, and their absolute belief in their own superiority. The current peace summit had been called to address the growing tensions between the Outer Rim colonies and the established core worlds. Pirates had been raiding supply convoys with increasing boldness, and several trade routes had become too dangerous to use. The various species blamed each other for the security failures, and trust was at an all-time low. Humans had only been invited because of their rapid expansion into previously unexplored sectors. In just 2 centuries, they had established colonies on over 300 worlds, often in regions that other species had deemed too dangerous or worthless to settle. Their merchant fleets had become a common sight in even the most remote systems, carrying goods and messages between worlds that had never communicated before. But the established powers, particularly the Zephyrian Empire, viewed this expansion with suspicion and contempt. How could a species so young and supposedly primitive achieve what had taken others millennia to accomplish? Surely it was just luck, or perhaps some form of crude aggression masquerading as exploration. Marcus shifted slightly as a group of insectoid delegates scuttled past, their compound eyes reflecting the station's artificial lighting. He had been standing at his post for over 6 hours, but marine training had conditioned him to endure far worse. His mind wandered to his home planet of New Fresno, where his daughter was probably just waking up for school. The thought of her smile gave him strength to maintain his stoic expression. Human. The word was spoken with obvious disdain. Marcus turned his head slightly to see Kethavar approaching, his crystalline armor now showing angry red streaks. The royal guard moved with predatory grace, each step calculated to demonstrate his superior strength and conditioning. Your delegation speaks of peace, Kethavar continued, stopping just close enough to loom over the human marine. But your species knows only violence and chaos. You spread across the galaxy like a plague, consuming resources and disrupting established order. Marcus remained silent, his eyes focused straight ahead. Military protocol was clear. He was not to engage in political discussions or respond to provocations. But Kethavar seemed determined to elicit a response. I have studied your military history, the Zephyrian said, beginning to pace slowly around Marcus, like a predator circling prey. Your wars are crude affairs lacking any sense of honor or proper combat etiquette. You fight with machines and explosives, hiding behind technology instead of proving your worth through personal skill. Other delegates began to notice the confrontation, forming a loose circle around the 2 guards. Some species were naturally curious about displays of dominance, while others hoped to gain insight into the relative strengths of potential allies or enemies. The tension in the air was palpable as beings whispered among themselves in dozens of different languages. The Zephyrian Royal Guard has never been defeated in single combat. Kethavar announced loudly enough for all nearby delegates to hear. For over 800 years, we have maintained our honor through skill, discipline, and superior conditioning. No warrior in the galaxy can match our combat prowess. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes upon him. He knew that his response in this moment would reflect not just on himself, but on all of humanity. The peace summit hung in the balance, and any sign of weakness could undermine his species' credibility in the negotiations to come. But as he looked into Kethavar's multifaceted eyes, Marcus saw something that the alien probably didn't realize he was revealing. Beneath the arrogance and bluster, there was uncertainty. The Zephyrian was used to intimidating opponents with his reputation and physical presence, but he had never faced a human before. He was testing, probing for weaknesses, trying to understand what kind of threat this new species might represent. The station's artificial gravity hummed quietly beneath their feet as the confrontation stretched on. In the distance, the sounds of the ongoing summit could be heard, delegates arguing over trade routes and security protocols, their voices rising and falling like an alien symphony. But in this corridor, the only sound was the soft whisper of recycled air and the barely audible shifting of Kethavar's crystalline armor. Marcus made his decision. Slowly, deliberately, he turned to face the Zephyrian Royal Guard directly. His expression remained neutral, professional, but there was something in his eyes that made several nearby delegates step back involuntarily. It was the look of a man who had seen combat, who had survived situations that would break lesser beings, and who was absolutely unafraid of whatever challenge lay ahead. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus Chen stood perfectly still, his brown eyes locked with the multifaceted gaze of Kethavar. The Zephyrian's crystalline armor had shifted to a deep orange, a color that other delegates recognized, as extreme agitation mixed with growing respect for a potential threat. Ambassador Talara of the Vex Consortium fluttered her delicate wing membranes, nervously as she watched the confrontation unfold. In her 3 centuries of diplomatic service, she had witnessed countless displays of posturing between warrior species, but something about this moment felt different. The human stillness was not submission. It was the coiled potential of a predator deciding whether to strike. "You dare meet my gaze, mammal?" Kethavar's voice carried a note of surprise beneath its aggressive tone. In Zephyrian culture, direct eye contact was reserved for equals or for challenges to combat. Lesser beings always looked away when confronted by Royal Guard. Marcus said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The gathered delegates began to murmur among themselves, translating the exchange for species who couldn't understand galactic standard. The Rokari ambassador, a massive bear-like creature covered in thick fur, grunted approvingly. His species respected courage above all else, regardless of the source. Kethavar took another step closer, bringing his towering form within arm's reach of the human marine. His armor was now cycling through rapid color changes, orange to red to deep purple, as his emotional state fluctuated between anger and genuine curiosity. No being had ever stood their ground against him so calmly. "Perhaps you do not understand the gravity of your situation," the Zephyrian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am Kethavar, First Blade of the Royal Guard, victor of the Crimson Campaigns, defender of the Crystal Throne. I have personally defeated warriors from 47 different species in single combat. Their weapons hang in my trophy hall as testament to their failures." The crowd of onlookers continued to grow as word spread through the station. Delegates abandoned their discussions and hurried to witness what many believed would be a diplomatic incident of historic proportions. The air recycling systems worked, harder to compensate for the increased body heat and respiration of dozens of excited alien beings. Marcus felt the familiar calm that had carried him through countless battles settle over his mind. His training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, identify advantages and disadvantages, prepare for multiple scenarios. Kethavar was taller, heavier, and armed with natural weapons in the form of razor-sharp crystalline protrusions along his arms and legs. But Marcus had faced larger opponents before, and he knew that size wasn't everything in combat. "I offer you one final chance to show proper respect," Kethavar announced loudly enough for all to hear. "Acknowledge the superiority of the Zephyrian Empire and your species' inferior status, and I will consider this matter closed." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval tournament. Every being present understood that this was no longer just about personal pride. It was about the relative standing of entire civilizations. If the human backed down now, it would confirm what many species already believed, that humanity was too young and weak to deserve a place at the galactic table. Marcus could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He thought about his daughter again, about the future she would inherit based on the choices made in moments like this. He thought about every human colony struggling to establish itself in a hostile galaxy, every merchant ship running dangerous routes to bring hope to distant settlements, every marine who had died protecting the dream of humanity among the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "I understand the gravity perfectly." The simple word sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Some beings had never heard a human speak before, and they were surprised by the lack of any obvious emotion in his tone. There was no fear, no anger, no desperation, just a calm acknowledgement of the situation. Kethvar's armor flashed bright yellow, the color of shock, before quickly cycling back to aggressive red. "You dare to... I understand that you've never faced a human in combat," Marcus continued, his voice still perfectly level. "I understand that your reputation is built on victories against species who fight for glory, honor, or territorial gain. But you should understand something too." The Marine took a single step forward, closing the distance between them until he was well within the Zephyrian's personal space. Despite the significant height difference, somehow Marcus didn't seem smaller. If anything, his presence seemed to expand, filling the corridor with an aura of quiet confidence that made several nearby delegates unconsciously step back. "Humans don't fight for glory," Marcus said, each word carefully measured. "We don't fight for honor or conquest or to prove our superiority. We fight for something much more dangerous than any of that." Kethvar's armor was now cycling rapidly through multiple colors as his sophisticated emotional control began to slip. Never in his extensive combat experience had an opponent spoken to him with such casual certainty. The human's words carried an undertone of something he couldn't identify, something that set off ancient survival instincts buried deep in his genetic memory. "And what do humans fight for?" the Royal Guard demanded, though part of him was no longer certain he wanted to know the answer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Kethvar's face. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every battlefield he had walked, every brother and sister in arms he had lost, every family he had fought to protect. "We fight for each other," he said simply. "We fight because someone we love is standing behind us, counting on us to come home. We fight because the alternative is watching everything we care about burn. And when you fight for something like that, losing isn't an option you can afford to consider." The corridor had gone completely silent except for the soft hum of the station's systems. Even the background noise from the ongoing summit seemed muted, as if the entire structure was holding its breath. The assembled delegates stared at the two warriors, many of them beginning to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In galactic diplomatic history, Kethvar's armor finally settled into a deep blue, the color of uncertainty, mixed with growing comprehension. For the first time in his long and distinguished career, he was facing an opponent whose motivations he couldn't fully understand or dismiss. The human's words had revealed something that the Royal Guard's extensive military training hadn't prepared him for. A warrior who fought not for personal glory, but for something infinitely more powerful and dangerous. The tension in the corridor had reached a breaking point. Word of the confrontation had spread throughout Harmony Prime, and delegates from every major species were now present, forming concentric circles around the two warriors. Some had climbed onto maintenance platforms or activated hover devices to get a better view over the heads of taller beings. Ambassador Zerion of the Centauri Federation pushed through the crowd, his three arms gesturing frantically as he tried to restore order. As the senior diplomatic representative present, he knew that any violence between guards could derail the entire peace summit and potentially trigger conflicts across multiple star systems. "This is highly irregular," Zerion announced in his melodious voice, which automatically translated into dozens of languages through the crowd's universal translators. "Station regulations clearly prohibit any form of combat between diplomatic security personnel. I must insist that both parties return to their designated positions immediately." But neither Marcus nor Kethvar acknowledged the ambassador's words. They remained locked in their silent standoff, two apex predators sizing each other up with the patience of beings who understood that the next few moments would define not just their own fates, but potentially the future relationships between their species. Dr. Yeshka, the station's chief xenopsychologist, watched the scene with professional fascination. The elderly Thylorian had studied interspecies conflict for over a century, and she recognized something unusual in the dynamics at play. Most confrontations between warrior cultures followed predictable patterns: threats, posturing, escalation, and either combat or submission. But this human was following none of the expected behavioral models. Fascinating, she whispered to her assistant, a young Vegan named Poltar, who was frantically taking notes on his data pad. The human shows none of the biochemical markers we typically associate with pre-combat aggression. His heart rate is actually decreasing, and his stress hormones are at baseline levels. Kethvar, meanwhile, was experiencing something entirely foreign to his warrior conditioning. The Zephyrian Royal Guard were trained from hatching to read their opponents, to identify weaknesses and exploit them with ruthless efficiency. But Marcus Chen presented no obvious openings, no signs of fear or uncertainty that could be leveraged. It was like trying to intimidate a mountain, technically possible, but ultimately pointless. "You speak of fighting for others," Kethvar said finally, his voice betraying the first hints of genuine curiosity beneath his aggressive posture. "But your species has a reputation for individual achievement, for competing among yourselves. How can you claim to fight for unity when your own kind wars against itself?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, the first movement he had made in several minutes. "Have you ever studied human military history beyond the surface level?" The question caught the Royal Guard off balance. He had expected threats or challenges, not an invitation to academic discussion. "I have reviewed your major conflicts, yes. Crude affairs involving massive casualties and destructive weapons. Then you know about the siege of Stalingrad," Marcus said. 2.5 million casualties in a single battle. Or the beaches of Normandy, where soldiers charged into certain death because they knew someone had to take the beach. Or the frozen hills of Korea, where Marines held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. The names meant nothing to most of the assembled aliens, but they could hear something in the human's voice, a reverence that spoke of sacred history, of lessons learned in blood and sacrifice. "What you're missing," Marcus continued, "is that humans have always been at our best when we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. Those wars you call crude, they taught us that individual strength means nothing without teamwork. That the strongest warrior in the world can be defeated by ordinary people who refuse to give up." Kethavar's armor shifted to a pale green, the color of confusion mixed with growing interest. In Zephyrian culture, warriors were celebrated as individuals, their personal achievements elevated above all else. The concept of deliberate subordination of self to group was not just foreign, it was almost incomprehensible. "You would sacrifice personal glory for the benefit of others?" he asked. "Glory doesn't help you when you're bleeding out in a foxhole," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "But knowing that your squadmate will risk everything to pull you to safety? That's worth more than all the medals in the galaxy." The crowd stirred restlessly as the philosophical nature of the conversation became apparent. Some delegates had been hoping for a physical confrontation that would clearly establish dominance between the two species. Instead, they were witnessing something much more complex. A clash of fundamental worldviews that went to the heart of what it meant to be a warrior. Lieutenant Commander Sashida of the Aquarian Deep Fleet moved closer to get a better view. Her species had evolved in the crushing depths of ocean worlds, where survival depended on perfect cooperation between pod members. She understood what the human was describing in ways that air-breathing species might not. "The human speaks truth," she announced in her liquid voice, causing ripples of surprise through the crowd. "Those who fight for others carry different strength than those who fight for self. It is strength that does not break, because it comes from outside the individual." Kethvar's head swiveled toward the Aquarian, his armor flashing brief patterns of irritation. The Zephyrian Empire had fought several border skirmishes with the Deep Fleet over the past century, and he knew their warriors by reputation. If Commander Sashta was speaking in support of the human's position, it suggested implications he wasn't prepared to consider. "This is philosophy, not combat," he said dismissively. "Pretty words do not determine victory in battle." Marcus smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, a small, almost sad expression that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less. You're right. Words don't win fights. He reached up slowly and began removing his dress uniform's decorative elements, the ribbons, medals, and insignia that marked his rank and achievements. Each piece was placed carefully on a nearby maintenance panel, the metal items clicking softly against the station's hull plating. In my species' history, Marcus said as he worked, there's a story about 300 warriors who held a narrow pass against an army of over 200,000. They knew they were going to die. Every single one of them knew it. But they also knew that their sacrifice would buy time for their people to prepare defenses. The uniform modifications continued with methodical precision. Marcus removed his jacket and folded it neatly, revealing the simple black undershirt beneath. His movements were economical, practiced, the actions of someone who had prepared for combat so many times that it had become ritual. Those 300 warriors didn't fight for personal glory, he continued. They didn't fight to prove their individual strength or to win honor for themselves. They fought because behind them stood everything they had ever loved, and someone had to hold the line. When he was finished, Marcus stood in his basic uniform, having stripped away everything that marked him as anything other than a soldier. But somehow, in removing the symbols of rank and achievement, he seemed to have grown larger, more significant. The corridor was now packed with beings from every delegation present at the summit. Security personnel from multiple species stood ready to intervene if violence erupted, but none dared to move while the two warriors continued their verbal dance. Kethavar stared at the transformed human, his armor cycling through colors so rapidly that it created a shimmering rainbow effect across his crystalline surface. Something fundamental was shifting in his understanding, and he found himself asking a question that his warrior's pride should have forbidden. What happened to those 300? Marcus looked directly into Kethavar's multifaceted eyes, and for a moment the massive corridor fell away, leaving just two warriors suspended in space and time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. They died, he said simply. Every last one of them. But their sacrifice inspired their people to fight harder than they ever had before. The invading army was eventually defeated and their homeland remained free. The silence that followed was profound. Even the station's background hum seemed muted as hundreds of beings processed the implications of the human's words. In a galaxy where most species measured military success by conquest and territorial gain, the concept of victory through sacrifice was revolutionary. Kethavar's armor had settled into a deep purple streaked with silver, colors that his own species would have recognized as the mark of a warrior experiencing a fundamental shift in understanding. His extensive training had prepared him for many things, but not for an opponent who spoke of death as casually as others discussed the weather. You speak of defeat as if it were victory, he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier aggression. That's because you're thinking like a warrior who fights for himself, Marcus replied. When you fight for something bigger than your own life, the rules change. Winning isn't about surviving. It's about making sure what you're protecting continues to exist. Ambassador Talara fluttered her wing membranes nervously as she watched the exchange. The Vex Consortium had built their civilization on careful calculation of risk and reward, always seeking the path that minimized loss while maximizing gain. The human's philosophy was antithetical to everything her species had learned about survival. Yet she couldn't deny the effectiveness of human expansion across the galaxy. In just 2 centuries, they had established a presence in sectors that other species had written off as too dangerous or unprofitable to colonize. Perhaps there was more to their success than simple aggressive tendencies. Dr. Yeshka continued her observations, fascinated by the biochemical changes she was detecting in both warriors. Kethavar's stress indicators were spiking wildly as his worldview underwent rapid reconstruction, while Marcus remained in a state of calm alertness that suggested complete comfort with the situation. The human is displaying the neurological patterns we typically associate with protective behavior, she whispered to her assistant, but elevated to an extraordinary degree. It's as if his entire nervous system has been optimized for defending others rather than preserving self. General Morden of the Hegemony Defense Corps pushed forward through the crowd, his massive frame causing smaller beings to scatter. The armored reptilian had fought humans during the brief border wars 20 years ago, and he had first-hand experience of their combat capabilities. "I have faced your Marines in battle," he announced in his deep, rumbling voice. "They fight with a ferocity that defies logical explanation. Wounded soldiers who should have been incapacitated continued fighting. Units that should have retreated held positions against overwhelming odds." Marcus nodded acknowledgement to the general. "You fought the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force at Kepler Station." "You were there?" Morden's surprise was evident in his voice. "I was a corporal then. 2nd Squad, 1st Platoon." Marcus's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "You fought well. Your people showed courage." The hegemony general's crest flared with pride at the compliment, but also with confusion. "Then you know we inflicted heavy casualties on your forces. Yet you speak of our courage rather than seeking revenge for your fallen." "Because courage deserves respect regardless of which side shows it," Marcus said. "The Marines who died at Kepler knew the risks when they signed up. They made their choice, same as your soldiers did." Kethvar was now completely still, his armor locked into a pattern of deep blue and silver that his fellow Zephyrians would have recognized as profound contemplation. His entire understanding of combat psychology was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt by this quiet human who spoke of death and sacrifice as if they were tools in a workshop. "This philosophy," he said slowly, "this willingness to die, for others, it is not unique to your military, is it? Your entire species operates under these principles." Marcus considered the question carefully. "Not everyone. Humans are individuals, and we have our share of cowards and traitors and people who only look out for themselves. But when things get bad enough, when everything we care about is threatened, most of us will choose to stand together." "Even against superior odds?" "Especially against superior odds." Marcus's voice carried a quiet intensity that made several nearby delegates unconsciously step back. "My species has a saying, 'The only easy day was yesterday.' We don't expect things to be simple or safe. We expect them to be hard, and we prepare accordingly." Commander Sashta moved closer, her bioluminescent patches glowing with interest. "Your military training emphasizes unit cohesion over individual achievement?" "From day one," Marcus confirmed. "A Marine who saves himself by abandoning his squad is considered a failure, no matter how skilled he might be individually. But a Marine who dies protecting his brothers is honored forever." The Aquarian commander's patches flashed in patterns that her species used to indicate deep approval. "This explains the effectiveness of human small unit tactics. Your soldiers fight as if they share a single nervous system." Kethvar's head turned sharply toward Sashita. "Impossible. No species can achieve true telepathic combat coordination without technological augmentation." "Not telepathic," Marcus said. "Trust. When you know absolutely that the Marine next to you will die before he lets you down, you can anticipate his actions, coordinate your movements, fight as a unified force instead of just a collection of individuals." The Royal Guard's armor flashed yellow again, the color of shock mixed with dawning comprehension. Everything he had been taught about combat superiority was based on the assumption that individual skill was the ultimate determining factor. The idea that deliberately subordinating individual excellence to group effectiveness could actually increase overall combat capability was revolutionary. "You train your warriors to be less than they could be as individuals?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "We train them to be more than any individual could ever be alone. A human Marine isn't just one soldier. He's part of a machine that can think, adapt, and fight as a unified whole. And when that machine is motivated by love for family, home, and each other, it becomes something that individual warriors can't defeat no matter how skilled they are." The crowd had grown silent again as the implications of the conversation sank in. Many of the assembled beings were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a confrontation between two guards. They were observing a fundamental, philosophical debate about the nature of strength itself. Ambassador Zerion made another attempt to restore diplomatic order. Perhaps this discussion would be more appropriate in a formal setting where— "No," Kethvar interrupted, his voice carrying a new note of urgency. This cannot wait for formal proceedings. The royal guard took a step back from Marcus, then another, until there was enough space between them for what he intended to do next. His armor cycled through rapid color changes as he struggled with a decision that went against every instinct his training had ingrained in him. Finally, the crystalline exoskeleton settled into pure white, the rarest color in Zephyrian emotional displays, reserved for moments of absolute clarity and profound respect. "Human Marine," Kethavar said formally, "I wish to understand your way of war." The transformation in Kethavar's demeanor was so dramatic that several delegates thought their translators had malfunctioned. The proud, aggressive royal guard, who had been issuing challenges just minutes before, was now requesting instruction from the same human he had been trying to intimidate. Marcus studied the Zephyrian's white-armored form with the same careful attention he had given to every aspect of their confrontation. In his years of service, he had learned to recognize the difference between genuine curiosity and tactical deception. What he saw in Kethavar's posture and the steady glow of his armor convinced him that the alien's interest was authentic. "Understanding our way of war means understanding our way of peace," Marcus said finally. "The two aren't separate things for humans, they're part of the same philosophy." He gestured to the crowd of diverse beings surrounding them. "Look around you. How many different species are represented here? How many different ways of thinking, fighting, surviving?" Kethavar's multifaceted eyes swept across the assembled delegates, counting automatically. 47 confirmed species, with at least a dozen more present as observers or support staff. Exactly. And how does the Zephyrian Empire typically deal with that kind of diversity? The question was pointed but not accusatory. Marcus genuinely seemed interested in the answer, as if he were trying to understand something rather than score a debating point. Kethavar's armor flickered through several color changes before settling back into white. "We establish clear hierarchies based on strength and capability. Order is maintained through respect for superior force." "Which works," Marcus acknowledged. "Your empire has been stable for over 1,000 years, but it's also limited you to expansion through conquest and subjugation. You can only grow by making others submit to your way of doing things." Commander Sashta's bioluminescent patches pulsed with interest. The Aquarian Deep Fleet had observed this pattern in many surface-dwelling civilizations, and she was curious to see where the human was leading the discussion. "Humans do things differently," Marcus continued. "We don't try to make everyone else become like us. Instead, we figure out how to work with them the way they are." Dr. Yeshka pushed closer, her scientific instruments recording every word. As a xenopsychologist, she had spent decades studying the various approaches different species took to intergroup cooperation, and the human model was unlike anything in her extensive database. "Can you provide specific examples?" she asked, unable to contain her professional curiosity. Marcus nodded. "On New Harmony, we have a colony world where humans work alongside Thylorian engineers, vegan agricultural specialists, and Centauri administrative coordinators. Each species does what they're naturally good at, but they're all working toward the same goals." "Impossible," General Morden interjected. "Those species have incompatible environmental requirements. Thylorians need high humidity. Vegas requires specific soil compositions. Centauri can't function in gravity above 0.7 standard." "That's right," Marcus agreed. "So we built different habitation zones connected by transport tubes. The Thylorians handle underwater construction and maintenance. The Vegas manage the agricultural domes. The Centauri run the orbital coordination centers, and humans serve as intermediaries and general labor where needed." The simplicity of the solution was staggering in its implications. Most galactic civilizations approached diversity as a problem to be solved through dominance or segregation. The human approach treated it as a resource to be leveraged through cooperation. Ambassador Talara's wing membranes fluttered rapidly as she processed the information. "This requires extensive coordination and communication infrastructure. The administrative overhead alone must be enormous." "Less than you'd think," Marcus replied. "When everyone's working toward the same goals, coordination becomes easier, not harder. The Centauri love complex logistics, so they handle most of the planning. The Thylorians are natural problem solvers, so they troubleshoot technical issues. The Vegas are excellent at long-term resource management." "And the humans?" Kethavar asked. Marcus smiled again, that same small expression that somehow conveyed both humility and quiet confidence. We do whatever needs doing that nobody else can handle. Fix things that break, mediate disputes, provide security, adapt to changing conditions. Humans are generalists. We're not the best at any one thing, but we're pretty good at most things. The assembled delegates began murmuring among themselves as the implications sank in. The human model wasn't based on establishing dominance or creating rigid hierarchies. Instead, it was built around adaptive cooperation and mutual benefit, concepts that many species found difficult to comprehend. Lieutenant Yarzeth of the crystalline hegemony stepped forward, his translucent form refracting the corridor's lighting into rainbow patterns. This cooperation you describe, it assumes that all parties will act in good faith. What happens when they don't? How do you handle betrayal or incompetence? The question was one that went to the heart of every civilization's survival strategy. In a universe where resources were limited and competition was fierce, trust was a luxury that few species could afford. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. We've been betrayed. More than once. Species we helped establish colonies who then tried to claim exclusive territory rights. Trading partners who broke agreements when better deals came along. Even some humans who sold out their own people for personal gain. How did you respond? General Morden asked, his professional interest evident. Depends on the situation, Marcus said. Sometimes we fought. Sometimes we walked away and found better partners. Sometimes we figured out what went wrong and tried to fix it. Kethvar's armor shifted to pale yellow, confusion mixed with growing fascination. You don't always seek revenge for betrayal. Revenge is expensive, Marcus replied matter-of-factly. It costs time, resources, and lives that could be better spent on constructive activities. Unless someone represents an ongoing threat to our people, it's usually more profitable to just move on. The practicality of the response was almost as shocking as the philosophy behind it. Most warrior cultures placed enormous value on honor and the punishment of those who violated trust. The idea of simply walking away from betrayal was alien to many of the assembled beings. But you do fight when necessary, Commander Sashta observed. When we have to, Marcus confirmed. When someone threatens our people, our colonies, our way of life. When negotiation fails and withdrawal isn't an option. When the only choice left is to fight or watch everything we've built be destroyed. His voice had taken on a different tone, still calm, but with an underlying intensity that made the hair stand up on the backs of any beings who possessed such evolutionary responses. Several delegates found themselves unconsciously stepping back. And when humans do fight, General Morden said slowly, they fight with the same cooperative philosophy they use for everything else. Exactly. Marcus nodded. Human military doctrine is based on the same principles as human civilization. No individual warrior is expected to win battles alone. Every Marine, soldier, sailor, or pilot is part of a larger system that shares information, resources, and support. Kethvar was now completely still, his armor locked in pure white as he processed everything he had learned. The human approach to warfare wasn't just tactically different, it represented a fundamental reimagining of what strength meant and how it could be, applied. Show me, he said suddenly. The words caught everyone off guard, including Marcus. Show you what? Show me how human warriors fight together. Demonstrate this cooperative combat philosophy you describe. The request sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Many delegates had heard stories about human military capabilities, but few had ever seen them demonstrated firsthand. Ambassador Zerion immediately stepped forward, his 3 arms waving frantically. Absolutely not. Station regulations strictly prohibit any form of combat demonstration in diplomatic areas. The insurance implications alone. I'm not challenging him to fight, Kethvar interrupted. I'm asking him to teach me something I don't understand. Marcus looked around at the expectant faces surrounding them, then back at the Zephyrian Royal Guard. In Kethvar's posture and the steady white glow of his armor, he saw something that reminded him of his own early days in Marine training, the eagerness of someone encountering a new way of thinking about problems they thought they already understood. All right, he said finally, but not here and not alone. 2 hours later, the gymnasium section of Harmony Prime had been transformed into an impromptu amphitheater. Word of the demonstration had spread throughout the station, and delegates from every major species had, gathered to witness what many were calling a historic moment in interspecies military understanding, the gym's adaptive environment. Systems had been reconfigured to accommodate multiple atmospheric requirements simultaneously, creating distinct zones where different species could observe in comfort. Thylorians clustered near humidity generators, while crystalline beings gathered under enhanced lighting arrays, and deep space species huddled in artificially cooled areas. Marcus stood in the center of the exercise area, no longer alone. 3 other humans had joined him: Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the Diplomatic Security Detail, Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez from the Marine Contingent, and surprisingly, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's chief medical officer. Kethvar examined the assembled humans with professional interest. They represented different military specializations and even different branches of human service, yet they moved with the same unconscious coordination he had observed in the corridor earlier. "You brought a medic to a combat demonstration?" he asked, his armor displaying pale blue confusion. "Dr. Vasquez is former Navy Special Operations," Marcus explained. "Cross-training is standard in human military structure. Every medic can fight. Every fighter has medical training. Every specialist can perform multiple roles as needed." Ambassador Talara fluttered her wing membranes nervously from her observation platform. "This seems highly irregular. Combat demonstrations typically involve warriors of similar specialization." "That's exactly the point," Lieutenant Kim interjected. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "Human military effectiveness doesn't depend on individual specialization. It depends on how different specializations work together." Dr. Yeshka activated her recording equipment with barely contained excitement. As the galaxy's foremost expert on interspecies combat psychology, she was witnessing something that could revolutionize military science across dozens of civilizations. General Morden leaned forward on his observation platform, his massive frame causing the structure to creak slightly. "I am familiar with human small unit tactics from our previous conflicts, but I have never seen them demonstrated in controlled conditions." "What scenario would you like to see?" Marcus asked Kethvar. The Royal Guard considered carefully. His extensive training had included simulations of countless combat situations, and he wanted to choose something that would truly test the human claims about cooperative effectiveness. "A hostage rescue," he said finally. "Multiple objectives, time pressure, unknown opposition strength. The type of situation where individual warriors typically fail because they cannot adapt quickly enough to changing conditions." "Gunnery." Sergeant Rodriguez grinned, an expression that looked almost predatory on his scarred face. "Classic room clearing with civilian protection. Been there, done that." The gym's holographic systems activated, transforming the open space into a multi-level structure resembling a space station command center. Holographic civilians appeared in various locations, some clearly designated as hostages, others as potential threats, and still others as unknown variables. "Standard parameters," Marcus announced to his team. "Unknown number of hostiles, mixed civilian population, multiple objectives, time constraint." What happened next would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for decades to come. The 4 humans didn't pause to develop a detailed plan or assign specific roles. Instead, they moved with fluid coordination that seemed almost telepathic to the watching aliens. Hand signals, brief verbal cues, and subtle positioning changes conveyed more information than most species could manage, with extensive technological assistance. Lieutenant Kim took point, her movement through the simulated structure revealing her expertise in close-quarters combat. But instead of advancing alone, she maintained constant communication with her team, providing intelligence that shaped their collective approach. 2 hostiles, corner position, civilian proximity. She signaled in a combination of hand gestures and sub-vocalized, words that the station's systems picked up and transmitted to her teammates. Dr. Vasquez moved to a flanking position while simultaneously scanning for wounded civilians who might need immediate medical attention. Her movements were those of someone equally comfortable with a rifle or a medical scanner, able to transition between roles without conscious thought. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez established overwatch, his position selected not just for defensive advantage, but for its ability to support multiple team objectives simultaneously. His experience showed in the way he anticipated his teammates' needs and positioned himself to provide whatever support might be required. Marcus coordinated the overall effort while remaining ready to adapt to changing conditions, but most importantly, every team member was prepared to take command if circumstances required it. The demonstration continued for 20 minutes, with the holographic scenario becoming increasingly complex. Additional hostiles appeared. Civilians were wounded and needed evacuation. Time pressure mounted, and equipment failures forced rapid adaptation. Through it all, the humans maintained their seamless coordination. When Kim was temporarily pinned down by hostile fire, Vasquez immediately moved to support her without being asked. When Rodriguez's overwatch position became compromised, Marcus adjusted the entire team's approach to compensate. When new intelligence revealed additional objectives, they reorganized their priorities without missing a beat. Kethvar watched in growing amazement as his armor cycled through multiple colors. Everything he had been taught about combat effectiveness was being systematically contradicted by what he was witnessing. The humans weren't just cooperating, they were thinking as a collective organism, while maintaining individual initiative and adaptability. Impossible, breathed Commander Sashta from her observation platform. No species can achieve that level of coordination without extensive technological augmentation or telepathic capabilities. They're not telepathic, Dr. Yeshka said, studying her instruments intently, but their brainwave patterns are showing remarkable synchronization. It's as if their training has created artificial neural linkages through behavioral conditioning. The scenario reached its climax when the holographic systems introduced a critical decision point. The team could complete their primary objective of neutralizing hostile forces, or they could risk everything to save a group of civilians who had become trapped in a collapsing section of the structure. Without hesitation, all 4 humans moved toward the civilian rescue, abandoning their tactical advantages to focus on protecting innocent lives. Their movements were coordinated but desperate, each team member accepting enormous personal risk to ensure that others would survive. When the simulation ended, the gymnasium was completely silent except for the hum of environmental systems. The assembled delegates stared at the 4 humans, who were calmly checking their equipment and debriefing their performance as if they had just completed a routine training exercise. 17 hostiles neutralized, 23 civilians evacuated, 0 friendly casualties, Lieutenant Kim reported matter-of-factly. Mission parameters exceeded by 30% efficiency. General Morden was the first to speak from the observation area, his deep voice carrying a note of grudging respect. I have commanded armies for over 4 decades. I have never seen small unit coordination of that quality. How? Kethvar asked simply. His armor was now displaying a complex pattern of white, blue, and silver that his own species would have recognized as profound transformation of understanding. Marcus looked up at the towering royal guard, wiping sweat from his forehead with a casual gesture that somehow emphasized his humanity, training, trust, and shared purpose. We've worked together for years in simulations and real combat. We know each other's capabilities, limitations, and thought processes. Most importantly, we all believe in the same things, which are that every life has value, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. That protecting others is more important than protecting ourselves. That we're stronger together than any of us could ever be alone. Ambassador Zerion attempted once more to restore diplomatic order. This has been a fascinating demonstration, but we really should return to the scheduled summit proceedings. No, Kethvar interrupted, his voice carrying new authority and purpose. This cannot wait. The royal guard stepped into the exercise area, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a moment that would define the rest of his existence. Human Marine Marcus Chen, he said formally, I request permission to learn from your warriors. 2 hours later, the gymnasium section of Harmony Prime had been transformed into an impromptu amphitheater. Word of the demonstration had spread throughout the station, and delegates from every major species had gathered to witness what many were calling a historic moment in interspecies military understanding, the gym's adaptive environment. Systems had been reconfigured to accommodate multiple atmospheric requirements simultaneously, creating distinct zones where different species could observe in comfort. Thylorians clustered near humidity generators, while crystalline beings gathered under enhanced lighting arrays, and deep space species huddled in artificially cooled areas. Marcus stood in the center of the exercise area, no longer alone. 3 other humans had joined him, Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the Diplomatic Security Detail, Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez from the Marine Contingent, and surprisingly, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's chief medical officer. Cathvar examined the assembled humans with professional interest. They represented different military specializations and even different branches of human service, yet they moved with the same unconscious coordination he had observed in the corridor earlier. "You brought a medic to a combat demonstration?" he asked, his armor displaying pale blue confusion. "Dr. Vasquez is former Navy Special Operations," Marcus explained. "Cross-training is standard in human military structure. Every medic can fight. Every fighter has medical training. Every specialist can perform multiple roles as needed." Ambassador Talara fluttered her wing membranes nervously from her observation platform. "This seems highly irregular. Combat demonstrations typically involve warriors of similar specialization." "That's exactly the point," Lieutenant Kim interjected. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "Human military effectiveness doesn't depend on individual specialization. It depends on how different specializations work together." Dr. Yeshka activated her recording equipment with barely contained excitement. As the galaxy's foremost expert on interspecies combat psychology, she was witnessing something that could revolutionize military science across dozens of civilizations. General Morden leaned forward on his observation platform, his massive frame causing the structure to creak slightly. "I am familiar with human small unit tactics from our previous conflicts, but I have never seen them demonstrated in controlled conditions." "What scenario would you like to see?" Marcus asked Cathvar. The Royal Guard considered carefully. His extensive training had included simulations of countless combat situations, and he wanted to choose something that would truly test the human claims about cooperative effectiveness. "A hostage rescue," he said finally. "Multiple objectives, time pressure, unknown opposition strength. The type of situation where individual warriors typically fail because they cannot adapt quickly enough to changing conditions." "Gunnery." Sergeant Rodriguez grinned, an expression that looked almost predatory on his scarred face. "Classic room clearing with civilian protection. Been there, done that." The gym's holographic systems activated, transforming the open space into a multi-level structure resembling a space station command center. Holographic civilians appeared in various locations, some clearly designated as hostages, others as potential threats, and still others as unknown variables. "Standard parameters," Marcus announced to his team. "Unknown number of hostiles, mixed civilian population, multiple objectives, time constraint." What happened next would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for decades to come. The four humans didn't pause to develop a detailed plan or assign specific roles. Instead, they moved with fluid coordination that seemed almost telepathic to the watching aliens. Hand signals, brief verbal cues, and subtle positioning changes conveyed more information than most species could manage, with extensive technological assistance. Lieutenant Kim took point, her movement through the simulated structure revealing her expertise in close-quarters combat. But instead of advancing alone, she maintained constant communication with her team, providing intelligence that shaped their collective approach. "Two hostiles, corner position, civilian proximity," she signaled in a combination of hand gestures and sub-vocalized, words that the station's systems picked up and transmitted to her teammates. Dr. Vasquez moved to a flanking position while simultaneously scanning for wounded civilians who might need immediate medical attention. Her movements were those of someone equally comfortable with a rifle or a medical scanner, able to transition between roles without conscious thought. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez established overwatch, his position selected not just for defensive advantage, but for its ability to support multiple team objectives simultaneously. His experience showed in the way he anticipated his teammates' needs and positioned himself to provide whatever support might be required. Marcus coordinated the overall effort while remaining ready to adapt to changing conditions, but most importantly, every team member was prepared to take command if circumstances required it. The demonstration continued for 20 minutes, with the holographic scenario becoming increasingly complex. Additional hostiles appeared. Civilians were wounded and needed evacuation. Time pressure mounted, and equipment failures forced rapid adaptation. Through it all, the humans maintained their seamless coordination. When Kim was temporarily pinned down by hostile fire, Vasquez immediately moved to support her without being asked. When Rodriguez's overwatch position became compromised, Marcus adjusted the entire team's approach to compensate. When new intelligence revealed additional objectives, they reorganized their priorities without missing a beat. Kethvar watched in growing amazement as his armor cycled through multiple colors. Everything he had been taught about combat effectiveness was being systematically contradicted by what he was witnessing. The humans weren't just cooperating, they were thinking as a collective organism, while maintaining individual initiative and adaptability. Impossible, breathed Commander Sashta from her observation platform. No species can achieve that level of coordination without extensive technological augmentation or telepathic capabilities. They're not telepathic, Dr. Yeshka said, studying her instruments intently, but their brainwave patterns are showing remarkable synchronization. It's as if their training has created artificial neural linkages through behavioral conditioning. The scenario reached its climax when the holographic systems introduced a critical decision point. The team could complete their primary objective of neutralizing hostile forces, or they could risk everything to save a group of civilians who had become trapped in a collapsing section of the structure. Without hesitation, all 4 humans moved toward the civilian rescue, abandoning their tactical advantages to focus on protecting innocent lives. Their movements were coordinated but desperate, each team member accepting enormous personal risk to ensure that others would survive. When the simulation ended, the gymnasium was completely silent except for the hum of environmental systems. The assembled delegates stared at the 4 humans, who were calmly checking their equipment and debriefing their performance as if they had just completed a routine training exercise. 17 hostiles neutralized, 23 civilians evacuated, 0 friendly casualties, Lieutenant Kim reported matter-of-factly. Mission parameters exceeded by 30% efficiency. General Morden was the first to speak from the observation area, his deep voice carrying a note of grudging respect. I have commanded armies for over 4 decades. I have never seen small unit coordination of that quality. How? Kethvar asked simply. His armor was now displaying a complex pattern of white, blue, and silver that his own species would have recognized as profound transformation of understanding. Marcus looked up at the towering royal guard, wiping sweat from his forehead with a casual gesture that somehow emphasized his humanity, training, trust, and shared purpose. We've worked together for years in simulations and real combat. We know each other's capabilities, limitations, and thought processes. Most importantly, we all believe in the same things, which are that every life has value, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. That protecting others is more important than protecting ourselves. That we're stronger together than any of us could ever be alone. Ambassador Zarion attempted once more to restore diplomatic order. This has been a fascinating demonstration, but we really should return to the scheduled summit proceedings. No, Kethvar interrupted, his voice carrying new authority and purpose. This cannot wait. The royal guard stepped into the exercise area, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a moment that would define the rest of his existence. Human Marine Marcus Chen, he said formally, I request permission to learn from your warriors. The formal request sent shockwaves through the assembled delegates that were felt far beyond the gymnasium walls. A Zephyrian royal guard, member of the most elite warrior caste in known space, was asking to learn from a species that many considered primitive newcomers to galactic civilization. Ambassador Zarion's 3 arms gestured frantically as he tried to comprehend the diplomatic implications. Exchange programs between military forces were not unprecedented, but they typically flowed in one direction, from established powers to developing species. The reversal of this dynamic challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic hierarchy. Marcus studied Kethvar's posture and the steady pattern of colors flowing across his crystalline armor. The sincerity was unmistakable, but the Marine also understood that this moment would have consequences far beyond their personal interaction. That's not my decision to make, Marcus said carefully. Military exchange programs require approval from both our governments, security clearances, diplomatic protocols. Then I will petition my emperor directly, Kethvar interrupted. I will stake my honor on the value of this knowledge. The magnitude of that statement was lost on no one present. Zephyrian culture placed absolute value on personal honor, and for a royal guard to stake his reputation on an untested proposition was virtually unprecedented. General Morden rose from his observation platform, his massive form commanding attention from every being in the gymnasium. The Hegemony Defense Corps would also be interested in observing such an exchange, he announced formally. What we have witnessed today suggests that our understanding of optimal military organization may be incomplete. Commander Sashta's bioluminescent patches flashed in rapid sequence, the Aquarian equivalent of excited agreement. The Deep Fleet concurs. These cooperative techniques could revolutionize underwater combat operations. Within minutes, representatives from a dozen different military organizations were formally requesting inclusion in what was rapidly becoming the most significant military development in centuries. The casual demonstration had accidentally triggered a fundamental shift in galactic strategic thinking. Dr. Yeshka pushed forward through the crowd, her scientific instruments still recording everything. From a xenopsychological perspective, this represents a breakthrough in interspecies understanding. The implications for diplomatic relations, trade cooperation, and conflict resolution are enormous. Ambassador Talara's wing membranes fluttered with barely controlled anxiety. This is happening too quickly. Such fundamental changes require careful consideration, extensive planning, risk assessment. Some opportunities don't wait for committees, Lieutenant Kim observed dryly. Human expansion didn't succeed because we spent decades planning every move. It succeeded because we were willing to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Chen Wei, commander of the human diplomatic mission. Marcus straightened automatically as his superior officer entered the gymnasium, followed by senior representatives from several other delegations. I've been monitoring the situation from the command center, Admiral Chen announced, his weathered face betraying no emotion. The communications traffic this has generated suggests that we're dealing with something rather more significant than a simple cultural exchange. Kethvar stepped forward, his armor shifting to pure white, the color of absolute respect and formal petition. Admiral, I request permission to address my proposal directly to your command structure. Granted, Admiral Chen replied, though his eyes were already scanning the assembled crowd and calculating political implications. The Zephyrian Empire has built its strength on the principle of individual excellence, Kethvar began, his voice carrying to every being in the gymnasium. For over 1,000 years, this philosophy has served us well. Our warriors are feared throughout the galaxy. Our territories are secure. Our enemies respect our power. He paused, his armor cycling through deep blue patterns that indicated profound contemplation. But today, I have seen something that challenges everything I thought I knew about strength. I have witnessed 4 warriors accomplish what I believed would require an entire squadron of royal guards. More importantly, I have seen them do it while prioritizing the protection of others over their own survival. General Morden nodded slowly. The human demonstration revealed tactical capabilities that exceed current galactic military models by significant margins. It's more than tactics, Dr. Vasquez interjected. It's a completely different way of thinking about what warriors are supposed to accomplish. Most species train their fighters to win battles. Humans train their fighters to protect people. Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment, weighing options and consequences with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating complex political situations. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of final decision. The human government has always believed that our greatest strength lies not in our technology or our individual capabilities, but in our ability to bring different peoples together for common purposes, he said. If the Zephyrian Empire is genuinely interested in learning our methods, we would be honored to share them. The formal acceptance sent another wave of excitement through the assembled delegates. What had begun as a confrontation between 2 guards was now evolving into a historic agreement between civilizations. Kethvar's armor flashed brilliant white before settling into a complex pattern that combined respect, gratitude, and determination. I pledge by my honor as Royal Guard that this knowledge will be used only for the protection of innocent life and the preservation of peace. That's all we've ever asked of anyone, Marcus said simply. Ambassador Zarian made one final attempt to impose diplomatic order on the rapidly evolving situation. Such an agreement requires extensive documentation, security protocols, oversight committees. Actually, Admiral Chen interrupted with a slight smile. It doesn't. The human delegation came to this summit with broad authority to establish cooperative relationships that advance galactic peace and security. I believe this qualifies. Within hours, the impromptu agreement had expanded to include participants from 18 different species. The Peace Summit's original agenda was quietly set aside as delegates, focused on what many were already calling the Harmony Accords, a framework for sharing military knowledge and cooperative techniques across traditional species boundaries. Marcus found himself standing once again in the corridor where the confrontation had begun, but now the space buzzed with excited conversation in dozens of languages as beings who had never spoken to each other before began planning joint training exercises and cultural exchanges. Kethavar approached, his armor displaying the calm blue patterns of contentment and satisfaction. I owe you an apology, Marine Chen. I came here believing that strength could only be measured through individual dominance. You have shown me that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than pushing them down. You don't owe me anything, Marcus replied. You were doing what you thought was right based on what you'd been taught. That's all any of us can do. What will you do now? The Zephyrian asked. Marcus smiled, looking out through the station's massive viewports at the stars beyond. Same thing I've always done. Try to make things a little better for the people I care about, help where I can, learn from anyone willing to teach me something useful. And if someone threatens your people, the Marine's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew harder, more focused. Then they'll discover why human cooperation is so effective in combat. Not because we're trying to prove how strong we are, but because we're protecting everything we love. Kethavar's armor flashed white one final time, before settling into the golden hues that indicated deep contentment. I understand now why your species has been so successful. You don't fight to conquer, you fight to preserve, and there is no force in the galaxy more dangerous than someone fighting to protect their family. As the two warriors stood together looking out at the stars, word of the Harmony Accords continued to spread across the galaxy. Within weeks, the first joint training facilities would be established. Within months, cooperative military units would be conducting operations that no single species could have accomplished alone. The confrontation that had begun with insults and posturing had evolved into something that would reshape galactic civilization for generations to come, and at its heart was a simple truth that humanity had learned through centuries of conflict and cooperation: that the strongest warriors are not those who fight for glory or conquest, but those who fight for each other. In the end, the wordless clash had spoken volumes about the power of understanding, the strength found in unity, and the revolutionary idea that true warriors protect rather than dominate. The galaxy would never be quite the same again,